October 25, 1949. Chinese nationalists are in disarray as the victorious communists advance from the north. Their next target is a small island of Kinmen, located only 10 kilometers from the mainland. The communists have seldom failed before, even despite not having a navy, so they expect little resistance. Under cover of darkness, they approach the northern part of the island in the wooden junks and make a landing. Though nationalists offer a higher than usual resistance, the landing succeeds. For a time, it seems like the defenders won't hold. All that is left for the communists is to take the junks across the strait, bring the reinforcements in, and secure victory. As the boats start to steer back to the mainland, a lone ship appears at the western tip of an island. This is the Nationalist Navy's Changyang, an American-made LST-class landing craft. She might be a support vessel, but 8 40mm Boforses and 12 20mm Ehrlichons installed on her are no joke for almost medieval wooden boats. Her searchlights join the coastal ones, and soon her armament enters the fray. A short, one-sided exchange of fire and most of the Western Communist fleet is no more. Those who do escape tell their comrades on the mainland that the sea is contested, so no reinforcements will come. 3 days later, the remnants of the communist forces are encircled and surrender, resulting in a nationalist victory. Kuomintang has been losing on the land for a while now, but this battle proves they still can hold the islands, so Chiang Kai-shek cancels his plans for futile resistance on the mainland and diverts his focus on Taiwan, ensuring the survival of the Republic of China to this day. So it can produce bleeding-edge semiconductors for you to enjoy this video. The funniest part is that the Changyang should have never been there in the first place. The sole reason she did was waiting for goods in exchange for sugar she smuggled to the island. So basically, corruption saved Taiwan, although by a pure coincidence. But the good corruption is not restricted to once-in-a-lifetime situations. In this video, we will casually learn how it can systematically save people from inhumane regimes, create art, and at the end of the day, destroy the oppressive government by undermining its legitimacy. Formally, corruption is often described as the use of power for personal gain. While this definition is successful in including the widest range of situations people recognize as corrupt, it presents corruption as a one-sided activity, while in reality it can be conducted to the mutual benefit of both the person in power and the person they are dealing with, but against the public interest or the interest of the state. Public interests are hard to define, especially in non-democratic nations, but the interests of the state have clear representation, the law. So, an extended definition of corruption I would suggest is the use of power for personal gain and against the interest of the power-holding body, often represented by the law, or, to make it simpler, doing something you approve of while the state would disapprove if it knew about it. How can something illegal be good? If corruption is morally wrong because for most of the time the law stands for something morally right, then the only situation corruption can be good is when the law itself is dubious or bad or outright horrific. And that's exactly the cases I will talk about. After some obscure Austrian painter with a dubious remaster of Marxist class struggle took power in Germany in 1933, life started to get increasingly harder for the so-called known Aryans. They were not only discriminated against informally, but also banned from public service, deprived of citizenship, and excluded from social and economic relations with Aryans, essentially locking minorities into their own small ecosystems, with limited prospects of survival, let alone having a decent life. The government not only turned a blind eye to violence towards the minorities, but promoted it, resulting in Kristallnacht and outright genocide since 1941. This is Edward Bloch. He was a Jewish physician in the Austrian city of Linz. After Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, he faced a lot of restriction that all other Jews had, but his house wasn't marked, and he was not required to wear David's star. He was allowed to buy necessities from non-Jews as well, and nobody interfered until he sold his house at market value and left the Third Reich for the United States in November 1940, 2 years after the illegal immigration from Germany became almost impossible for minorities. But why such preferential treatment? You see, Dr. Bloch was once one poor family's physician and treated a woman with breast cancer and her frail son 30 years before the notorious Anschluss. Mother's name was Clara, and the boy's Adolf. And you probably already guessed the surname. Clara Hitler didn't survive, but her son's gratitude towards the honorable Jew, as he calls the doctor, did. The dictator felt indebted to the physician and repaid in kind, although the Reich's law would never allow such treatment. Corruption doesn't always involve money. Sometimes connections and reputations are even more important. Emil Morris, a half-Jew and a Nazi party member, was also protected by Hitler and Göring, but such cases were extremely rare. Within a short window of 1933 and 1938, Jews and other minorities could leave Germany, although with many limitations, so about 300,000 of them did. After November 1938, however, bribery became the main way to leave the death trap Nazi state transformed into. Several thousand used this informal mechanism and survived, and though this figure pales in comparison to the number of people killed by the regime, it reminds us that sometimes corruption can save lives. But there is more to good corruption than that, and the next story is not as dark. Among the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, one was seen by the ordinary citizens as the most prosperous, culturally distinct, and the most corrupt at the same time. This super republic was it was Georgia. All of the Soviet citrus and tea production, and most of the Union's tourism came from here, allowing Georgians to reap monopolistic profits, as far as profits go in Soviet planned economy, that is. Georgian and Russian were two official languages, but in practice, ever since the death of Stalin and end to his Russification push, almost everything that wasn't related to military installations, road infrastructure, or other things standardized on the whole Union's level, was produced exclusively in Georgian. Books, movies, signs of buildings, internal documents even. And the informal side of the republic was enormous. Georgia produced the most organized criminals per capita. De facto private construction cooperatives and restaurants were all across the country, while most of the Union could never have dreamed of it. Most of these benefits vanished after the fall of the USSR without a trace. Sure, some wealth generated in the Soviet period stayed, but most of it was lost, as what was great for the Soviet market wasn't for the international one. Works of art were saved, but the competition from Western cultural products made them far less relevant, even to Georgian audiences. Thousands of mini-villas, built by illicit contractors, still decorate their Georgian rural regions, but most of them were abandoned as people moved to the cities, and small restaurants and shops lost to bigger Georgian or international chains. However, the urban architecture stayed. This is how most people imagine Soviet buildings, and that's true for the vast majority of them. However, in the national republics, that's how Soviet states other than Russia, Ukraine and Belarus are often called, authorities often turned a blind eye on local architects deviating from the typical design to include national cultural elements and encourage domestic architectural thought, even if this was against the Union official stance since 1955. But one example is especially interesting. This is probably the most famous Soviet building in Tbilisi, the HQ of the Ministry of Highways of the Georgian Soviet Republic, now the main office for the Bank of Georgia, the second largest bank in the country. It manages to combine brutalist architecture and landscape integration, almost as the creator intended to fuse obviously man-made structure with nature. Oh, by the way, here's the architect. And here's the deputy minister who proposed the building. Don't you think that's kind of suspicious? The Georgian authorities presumably didn't, though the construction was approved. And that's how corruption gave birth to one of the finest examples of Soviet architecture in the nation. However, corruption didn't just diversify the architecture of the Union. There is a reason to believe that it eroded the USSR's legitimacy and helped in its downfall.
That this man, he laid down his money, and then the fellow that was in charge said to him, "Okay, come back in 10 years and get your car." And he said, "Morning or afternoon?" And the fellow behind the counter said, "Well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make?" And he said, "Well, the plumber's coming in the morning."
This may be a funny story, but as they say in Russia, every joke is only partly a joke. The English equivalent would be every joke has a grain of truth. The late Soviet Union was notorious for a deficit of simple consumer goods or even necessities like meat and bread. While most of the people didn't outright starve, spending hours in lines to get something people even in poor economies could buy on a whim was humiliating and ruins the image of prosperity the Communist Party tried to paint for decades. The formal economy was 100% state-owned, so all market-based activities were practically illegal. Soviet nominal wages grew rapidly at the time, but there were no goods to buy with them, though the shadow economy, with prices often 10, 20 or even 50 times higher than those set by the state, partly compensated for the deficit in legal stores. However, this meant that only the rich, by Soviet standards, or well-connected people could afford basic human decency, which not only highlighted the impotence of the Soviet state, but eroded its core myth of equality. While a myriad of factors contributed to the fall of the USSR, collapse of oil prices, the unpopular war in Afghanistan, sky-high military expenditure despite the civilian economy's troubles, the widespread corruption was probably the most vivid problem for the ordinary Soviet citizen. While it helped some people who had the money and the connections to escape the grim reality of chronic deficit, for the vast majority, it finally broke the illusion of solidarity within the Union, convincing them that communism was probably BS and they would be better off without it. Now, don't get me wrong, for the majority of situations corruption is bad, especially to people living in democracies or under competent governments, which generally pursue benevolent policies. Most of the states throughout history tried to be just, at least in some matters. You would not call a corrupt policeman good if he let simple robbery or murder slip. However, when it gets political or ideological, or when the state itself is pure evil, subverting it may be considered not only justifiable, but morally imperative. Corruption saved thousands of people from murderous regimes, helped create art when the state's policy was to build everything grey, and brought an end to tyranny in some parts of the world. And let's not forget, although by pure coincidence, it helped save Taiwan, one of the most wholesome Asian nations. So yes, in very rare instances, corruption may be good. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe and watch my other videos, pretty please. And as always, thank you for watching.
Corrupt KMT.